They laughed at him, a broken veteran living alone in a frozen forest with nothing but a German shepherd. They said winter would finish what the war couldn't. Then the blizzard came, swallowing roads, silencing the world, and turning the woods into white death. In the middle of that storm, his dog suddenly stopped, lifted his nose, and found a life fading in the snow. That night a fire stayed alive, a door was opened, and the man everyone dismissed became the reason 2 souls survived. This is not luck. This is faith. This is a quiet miracle. If stories like this matter to you, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more. Winter arrived early in Pine Hollow, not with drama, but with a quiet certainty. A thin, gray sky pressing low over the town as if reminding everyone who would win in the end. Ethan Parker returned the way broken machinery returns to a workshop, functional, scarred, and quietly judged for every sound it made. He was 45, though the lines in his face suggested a longer accounting. His frame was broad but worn down, the build of a man who had once been trained for efficiency rather than comfort, shoulders squared by habit rather than confidence. His jaw was angular, almost too sharp, shadowed by a rough beard he kept trimmed only when it interfered with work. The beard had more gray in it than he cared to notice, especially around the chin, where stress seemed to settle and refuse to leave. His hair, once dark brown, had thinned slightly at the temples, cropped short not for style but because long hair felt like something that could be grabbed, pulled, used against him. His eyes were hazel, pale in certain light, the kind that looked calm until someone held his gaze too long and realized how little sleep lived behind them. Ethan slept in the cab of a rusted pickup parked at the edge of town, the vinyl seat cracked like old skin, the heater unreliable, the windows fogging with every breath. He had debts he didn't speak of and memories he didn't volunteer. People in Pine Hollow knew enough to label him without asking questions. Veteran, laborer, drifter, the kind of man you nodded at but didn't invite in. Noise unsettled him. The clang of dropped tools, laughter that rose too fast, questions that came with expectations. He learned quickly which hours the town was loudest and adjusted his life around avoidance. Mornings before sunrise were safest. Evenings were dangerous. During the day, Ethan worked at Hale Timber, a low-slung sawmill that smelled of sap, oil, and old winters. The work was heavy and poorly paid, but it was honest, and honesty mattered to him in ways he couldn't explain. His foreman, a compact man named Rick Hale, spoke little and asked fewer questions. Rick was in his early 50s, stocky with a permanent crease between his brows and a limp earned from a logging accident years back. He didn't care why Ethan needed extra shifts or why he flinched at sudden noise. He cared that Ethan showed up on time, worked without complaint, and stacked lumber straight. For that, he paid him cash when he could and left the rest unspoken. It was the evenings that unsettled the town. After work, Ethan didn't go to the bar or the diner where people warmed themselves with coffee and commentary. Instead, he loaded supplies into his truck: scrap wood, a coil of wire, nails bought 1 box at a time, a battered tarp, and a hand-crank radio missing its back panel. He drove past the last street light and into the narrowing road that climbed toward the forested ridgeline. That was when the whispers began. Men leaning against tailgates smirked. A woman at the gas pump shook her head. Someone laughed openly one night and said, "Guy like that thinks he can beat winter with scraps." The laughter followed Ethan like a thrown stone. He didn't turn around. The only creature who followed him willingly was Coda. Coda was a German shepherd, 7 years old, with a sable coat dark along the spine and lighter at the legs, the colors blending like smoke caught mid-motion. He was large without being bulky, built for endurance rather than intimidation, muscles lean and disciplined beneath thick fur already grown in for winter. One ear bore a small notch near the tip, an old injury that had healed cleanly, and his muzzle was beginning to silver, not from age alone, but from exposure to long nights, dust, and vigilance. His eyes were mismatched in a subtle way, one a deeper brown than the other, giving his stare a questioning quality, as if he were always assessing intent. Koda moved with restraint, every step economical, every pause deliberate. He did not bark unless there was reason. When he did, Ethan listened. Koda had been Ethan's partner before he was his companion. Not a pet, a constant. In the years that reshaped Ethan's understanding of time, Koda had learned the difference between chaos and threat, between panic and necessity. Now, in Pine Hollow, Koda stayed close, brushing Ethan's knee when crowds tightened, placing his weight against Ethan's leg when the man's breathing went shallow. At night in the truck, Koda curled across Ethan's boots, a living barrier between him and the cold. Ethan's decision to build in the forest was not impulsive. It was the result of quiet math done over many sleepless nights. The forest was cold, yes, but it was predictable. Wind, snow, hunger. These things followed rules. People did not. The land he chose lay a mile beyond the last maintained road, near a shallow creek that froze unevenly, stones protruding like knuckles beneath the ice. The clearing was small, shielded on the north by a rise of rock and dense pine, a place the wind passed over rather than through. When Ethan first stood there, breath fogging in the thin light, something inside him eased. Not peace, relief. He worked until dark most evenings, hauling materials by headlamp, setting aside pieces that might become walls, imagining a structure no larger than necessary. A shack, not a cabin, a place to keep fire and breath alive. He drove stakes into frozen ground, hands stiff, skin splitting despite gloves. Koda circled the perimeter, nose low, cataloging the world. Deer, fox, old ash. The faint trace of human footsteps days old. When Koda settled beside Ethan, he did so facing outward, guarding without being asked. Back in town, the story took shape without Ethan's input. At Murphy's Diner, Sarah Whitlow wiped down counters and listened. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with a quiet posture that suggested she'd learned early not to take up unnecessary space. Her hair was a soft chestnut brown, usually pulled into a loose ponytail that escaped at the temples, framing a face dusted with freckles that showed more clearly in winter light. Her skin was pale in the northern way, weathered but not hardened, and her eyes, gray-blue, observant, missed very little. Sarah had grown up in Pine Hollow, left once for college, returned when caring for a sick parent became a permanent commitment. She listened more than she spoke, especially when men talked too loudly about things they didn't understand. "Won't last," someone said one night between bites of toast. "Winter'll finish what the army didn't." Laughter followed. Sarah's hands paused on the rag. She pictured Ethan's back as he loaded lumber, the dog at his side, the silence he carried like a second coat. She didn't defend him. In Pine Hollow, defense often made things worse, but the words stayed with her. Ethan heard enough to know the shape of their judgments. He had worn worse labels: fool, ghost, liability. He accepted ridicule the way he accepted cold, with preparation. Each night in the forest he added another small improvement: a tighter knot, a better angle. He began framing a narrow overhang beside the shack, barely large enough to block wind, and when Koda watched him curiously, Ethan said quietly, If someone's out there, this might help. He didn't know who he meant. He only knew that survival meant leaving space for others, even if you hoped no one ever needed it. When darkness fell, Ethan sat on a log, hands throbbing, listening to the forest settle. The town's laughter faded with distance, replaced by wind through pine needles and the soft crunch of Coda shifting his weight. The sky above the clearing held no promises, only stars cold and indifferent. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, feeling the ache in his bones, the familiar heaviness behind his eyes. He was tired in ways sleep couldn't fix, but for the first time in months, he was exactly where he had chosen to be. Coda leaned into him, solid and warm. Ethan rested a hand in the thick fur at the dog's neck and exhaled slowly, a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Tomorrow, he would bring more wood. Tomorrow, the shack would rise another inch. Let them laugh. Winter was coming, and Ethan was already building. Snow thickened over Pine Hollow the way debt thickens over a man's chest. Quietly at first, then all at once until breathing required effort. The roads narrowed, the sky dropped lower, and the town's confidence faded with the daylight. Work at Hale Timber slowed as orders dried up. Some days Ethan Parker was sent home by noon, Rick Hale offering a tight nod that meant apology without words. Ethan accepted it the same way he accepted everything else, with a short nod and no complaint. He used the extra hours to do what winter demanded: prepare or fail. Each return to town cost him something. He bought salt, flour, batteries, cheap painkillers, and fuel when he could afford it, always calculating weight against necessity. The store felt smaller now, tighter, the aisles crowded with unspoken opinions. Conversations dropped when he entered. Laughter followed him out. Someone muttered that the woods would teach him a lesson. Ethan didn't respond. Silence had become a form of armor. The more they talked, the harder he worked. He loaded the truck, hands cracked and bleeding despite the cold numbing the pain, and drove back toward the forest with Coda sitting upright beside him, eyes forward, body steady. In the clearing, progress was visible, but fragile. 2 walls of the shack now stood shoulder high, logs fitted with care, gaps chinked with moss and scrap cloth. It wasn't pretty. It was functional. Ethan worked until his arms shook, then worked a little more. Hunger gnawed at him in a dull, constant way. He rationed food the way he once rationed sleep, never enough, but controlled. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind found its way through seams he hadn't sealed yet, Ethan lay awake listening to the forest breathe. His mind betrayed him in those hours. Sounds became something else. The snap of a branch turned into a crack he recognized too well. His chest tightened. His breath shortened. Coda noticed before Ethan did. The dog would lift his head, move closer, and press his weight against Ethan's ribs. At 7 years old, Coda had learned the difference between guarding and grounding. He placed his muzzle against Ethan's sternum, warm breath steady, forcing rhythm back into the man's lungs. Ethan counted it out the way he'd been taught, in and out, matching the dog. The world narrowed to fur, heat, and the quiet insistence that the present was safer than memory. When the moment passed, Ethan rested his forehead against Coda's neck and whispered a thank you he didn't know how to say to anyone else. The nights were the worst. Daylight gave him purpose. Darkness invited reckoning. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and interrupted. When it did come, it brought half-dreams that left his muscles locked and his jaw aching. He woke more than once with his fists clenched, breath ragged, Coda already awake and watching him, tail still, eyes alert. The dog never flinched from these moments. He simply stayed. That constancy mattered more than comfort. One afternoon, as Ethan hauled stones from the creek to shore up the base of the wall, he noticed a change in the wind. It came sharper, cutting sideways instead of down, carrying a promise he didn't like. He worked faster, stacking stones, testing each one until it settled with a dull certainty. As dusk crept in, Ethan made a decision that surprised even him. He dragged spare boards to the side of the shack and began framing a narrow lean-to, barely large enough for a person to crouch beneath. It wasn't part of his original plan. It cost him time, energy, and materials he couldn't spare. Coda watched closely, head tilted, ears tracking the woods beyond the clearing. When Ethan paused to catch his breath, hands on his knees, the dog stepped closer, brushing his leg as if asking a question. Ethan answered without looking up. "If someone's out there," he said quietly, voice rough. "I don't want them to die because I wanted to be alone." The words hung in the cold air, heavier than the breath that carried them. He didn't know who he meant. He only knew that survival without mercy felt too close to something he'd left behind. Back in town, Sarah Whitlow noticed the change in him before most. She saw it in the way he moved through the diner on supply runs. Quieter, more distant, as if the forest had begun to claim him. Sarah was tall and lean, her posture straight despite long shifts on her feet. Her chestnut hair was pulled back more tightly now against the cold, and the skin of her hands showed fine cracks from constant washing and winter air. There was a steadiness to her, a patience shaped by responsibility and disappointment. She had learned how to observe without interfering. When men joked too loudly about Ethan freezing in the woods, she wiped the counter a little harder and said nothing. Silence, she knew, could be a kind of witness. Ethan's hands grew worse before they grew better. The skin split daily, thin red lines blooming and freezing over. He wrapped them at night with cloth soaked in ointment and ignored the sting when he worked. Pain was familiar, predictable. It made sense in a way other things did not. The shack rose inch by inch. A third wall took shape. The fire pit was ringed with stone. The lean-to stood crooked but serviceable. Its roof slanted to shed snow. When Ethan stepped back to look at it, he felt no pride. Only a grim satisfaction that something existed where nothing had before. Food ran low. He ate once a day now, small portions, chewing slowly to trick his body into feeling full. Coda ate first more often than not. Ethan told himself it was practical. The dog needed strength to guard. But there was truth beneath that excuse. Coda mattered more than comfort. Some nights, Ethan sat with his back against the wall, watching the fire sink into embers, listening to the wind work itself up. The forest was no longer empty to him. It felt watchful. Not hostile. Expectant. The first real freeze came hard. The creek locked solid overnight, ice thickening with a sound like a held breath finally released. Ethan woke to a silence so complete it rang. He stepped outside and felt the cold bite deep, immediate. His beard crusted with frost in minutes. Coda trotted ahead, paws crunching, breath steaming, perfectly at home. Ethan followed, stiffness easing as movement warmed him. He thought, not for the first time, that the dog belonged to this place in a way he himself was still earning. That night, as the temperature dropped further and the fire struggled, Ethan understood something with quiet clarity. He was not building to win. He was building to endure. The difference mattered. He fed the fire carefully, adjusted the chinking, checked the lean-to one last time. When he lay down, exhaustion finally pulling him under, Coda curled close. a solid line of warmth against the cold. Outside, winter tightened its grip, testing every seam. Inside, a man and his dog held steady, not because they were unafraid, but because they had decided not to quit. The storm arrived ahead of its own forecast, slipping down from the ridge like a verdict already decided. Snow began as a fine grit, then thickened into sheets that erased distance and depth, and the wind followed soon after, prying at the forest with fingers that knew where to hurt. Ethan Parker felt it in his joints before he saw it, a pressure change that tightened his shoulders and sharpened his focus. By the time the sky sealed shut, the shack stood unfinished. 3 walls solid, the 4th only half risen, the roof patched but not yet trusted. He moved without panic but not without urgency. The first gust struck the clearing and rattled the loose boards, turning the structure into a drum. Ethan braced a shoulder against the wall, listening to the way the sound traveled through the logs, learning what the shack could take. He dragged the tarp over the exposed side, fingers numb, nails biting through frozen cloth as he drove them home. Each strike rang too loud in the enclosed space, echoing into places he tried not to visit. He forced his breathing slow, steady, practical. Tasks first, thoughts later. Coda worked the perimeter like it was muscle memory. The German shepherd's sable coat bristled under the wind, dark fur lifting along his spine as he cut wide circles through the swirling white. He was 7 years old, but he moved like time had taught him economy rather than caution. His nose skimmed the ground, then lifted to test the air, ears swiveling to catch the groan of stressed trees. When a branch cracked somewhere beyond the clearing, Coda stopped, body angled, and let out a low warning that carried just far enough to be heard. He returned to Ethan's side only long enough to confirm the man was still anchored, then went back out, guarding against what the storm might send. Inside, Ethan rationed wood by instinct. He stacked it within arm's reach, counting not logs but minutes of heat. The fire took reluctantly at first, smoke fighting to escape through the imperfect chimney. He adjusted stones, coaxed the draw, and finally the flames settled into a steady, hungry rhythm. Snow found the gaps he hadn't sealed, needling in sideways, stinging his cracked hands. He layered scrapboards over the worst seams, wedging them tight, knowing it wouldn't be perfect. Only enough. Enough was the margin between surviving and failing. The wind rose again, louder now, and for a moment the sound changed. It wasn't just weather, it was movement with intent, a roar that flattened memory into the present. Ethan's chest tightened without asking permission. The shack wavered in his vision, walls breathing in and out as if unsure they belonged. His jaw locked. He tasted metal. The past crowded in, loud and immediate, the way it did when the night decided to test him. Coda reacted instantly. He closed the distance and pressed hard against Ethan's legs, then lifted his head and fixed him with that mismatched stare, one eye darker, both intent. The dog's presence was undeniable, a weight that insisted on now. Coda placed his muzzle against Ethan's chest, warm breath steady and deliberate, and stayed there until Ethan matched it. In, out, in, out. The storm screamed outside, indifferent, but inside the shack a man reclaimed himself one breath at a time. Hours stretched thin. Ethan fed the fire, adjusted the braces, checked the tarp, then checked them again. He moved with controlled efficiency, the way he always had when there was no room for error. Coda alternated between the doorway and the wall facing the wind, body angled to block drafts when he could, ears flicking at every change in pitch. When a tree fell somewhere close, the ground shuddered. The shack held. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't meant to keep. Near dawn, exhaustion caught him. Not the heavy kind that knocks a man flat, but the precise surgical fatigue that dulls edges and tempts mistakes. He slid down the wall and pulled his coat tighter, boots still on, unwilling to surrender readiness. Coda curled in close, a solid line of warmth against his side. Sleep came in a single, unbroken stretch, dreamless and deep, the kind Ethan had almost forgotten existed. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm were embarrassed by what it hadn't managed to do. The wind fell to a low murmur, then to nothing at all. When Ethan opened the door, the world beyond looked remade. Snow lay heavy and clean, sculpted into drifts that swallowed familiar shapes. Trees bowed under the weight, transformed into white-limbed statues. The shack stood there in it all, imperfect and upright, smoke lifting in a thin line from the chimney. Evidence. Ethan stepped out and sank to his calves. The cold bit, but it was honest now, not attacking. Coda bounded through the drifts, shaking snow from his coat, eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of movement. Ethan watched him and felt something loosen beneath his ribs. He hadn't beaten Winter. He'd met it and stayed standing. The distinction mattered. By late morning, the road back toward town was still buried. Ethan didn't try it. He focused on repairs, reinforcing the braces, shoveling snow away from the walls, banking it where it would seal drafts instead of creating pressure. The lean-to had held, crooked but intact. He straightened it, adding a crosspiece, the thought from earlier settling into purpose. This place could be more than a refuge for one. In Pine Hollow, the storm had left its mark in smaller ways. Power flickered. The diner opened late. Sarah Whitlow stood at the window between tables, coffee pot in hand, watching the road that disappeared toward the forest. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, her chestnut hair braided tight against the cold now, freckles standing out against pale skin flushed by the heater. Her eyes followed the snowfall with a quiet intensity, the kind that came from knowing how quickly things could go wrong. Someone mentioned Ethan's name, a joke half-formed, and let it die unfinished. Sarah said nothing. The silence felt different this time. That afternoon, Ethan took inventory. Supplies were low, but not gone. His hands ached, but they still worked. The shack bore scars, stress lines in the tarp, a brace slightly warped, but it stood. He sat on the log by the fire pit and looked out over the clearing, breath steady, mind calmer than it had been in weeks. Coda settled at his side, head on his knee, accepting the scratch behind his ear with a softening of posture that was almost a sigh. The storm had tested them and moved on. It would return. Ethan knew that. There would be worse nights, harder choices. But the shack existed now. Not just as an idea or a plan, but as a fact. He rested his hand on the rough wood and felt the truth of it. For the first time since coming back, Ethan believed something simple and dangerous. He might actually endure this place. The forest watched without comment. The dogs stayed close. Winter had made its first argument. Ethan had answered, and the answer still stood. The second storm did not announce itself with patience. It arrived like a clenched fist, snow falling straight down at first, thick and smothering, then driven sideways by a wind that bent the pines until they complained aloud. Ethan Parker felt the change before he saw it. The air turned brittle, sharp enough to sting his lungs. He stepped outside to check the chimney, beard already crusting with ice, and saw the world shrink to a few yards of white chaos. Coda followed without command, staying tight to Ethan's leg, his posture alert but controlled, ears swiveling, nose testing the storm. Inside the shack, the fire burned steady. Ethan fed it early, rationing with care, keeping the draw clean. Smoke rose in a thin, stubborn column above the roof. Not a signal meant for anyone, just proof of survival. Coda was the first to freeze. He stopped mid-step, head lifting, muzzle angling into the wind. The dog's body tightened, not with fear, but focus. Ethan watched him, trusting what years had taught him. Coda's nose lifted again. Then he took 3 deliberate steps forward and stopped, eyes locked on nothing Ethan could see. "You smell something," Ethan said aloud, grounding himself as much as the dog. Coda didn't look back. He moved. Ethan grabbed his coat and slung the radio strap over his shoulder out of habit more than plan. He stepped into the storm, boots sinking, wind tearing at his breath. Coda surged ahead a few paces, then checked himself, glancing back for permission. Ethan nodded once. The figures emerged slowly, wrong for the wind, staggered and human. The first was a woman, tall but bent forward, one arm wrapped around a child bundled in layers that made him look smaller rather than protected. She moved with stubborn momentum, the kind that came from responsibility carried too long. When Ethan reached them, he saw the damage Winter had done. The woman was in her mid-30s, lean beneath exhaustion, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a low, practical knot now undone by ice and wind. Her skin was pale and chapped, cheeks raw, lips cracked. Her eyes were gray-green and sharp despite fatigue, the eyes of someone trained to assess pain and push through it. Megan Turner, county nurse, though Ethan wouldn't learn the name until later. Her jacket bore the faint emblem of the health service, nearly lost beneath snow. The boy in her arms was small for 8, thin beneath the layers, eyelashes rimed with frost, his face a frightening shade of blue around the lips. His name was Liam. He made a sound that was more breath than voice when Coda pressed close, the dog's warmth immediate and instinctive. "Inside," Ethan said, voice cutting through the wind. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Megan tried to answer and couldn't. Her legs trembled. Ethan took her elbow, firm but careful, and half-guided, half-carried them back toward the shack. Coda stayed pressed to the boy's boots, body angled to block the wind, tail low and steady. The door slammed shut behind them, the storm cut off like a blade. Warmth rushed in uneven waves. Megan collapsed to her knees, clutching Liam tighter, shoulders shaking with delayed fear. Ethan knelt immediately, hands moving with practiced calm. He checked Liam's breathing, his pulse, the stiffness in his fingers. The boy was conscious but fading, eyes unfocused. Ethan shifted him closer to the fire, careful not to shock him with heat. Coda lay down on the other side without instruction, pressing his full length against the child, a living furnace. Liam's shivering eased. His eyes flicked to the dog, then held there. "Is he real?" he whispered. Coda huffed softly and nudged the boy's knee with his nose. Liam let out a breath that might have been a laugh and buried his fingers in thick fur. Megan forced herself upright, swaying. Up close, Ethan saw the lines at the corners of her eyes, the faint scar near her left temple, pale against wind-burned skin. She moved like someone accustomed to discomfort, posture disciplined even in collapse. "Megan Turner," she managed, voice hoarse but controlled. "Nurse." She swallowed. "We cut through the old service road. The car sank. Phones died." She didn't say the rest. Guilt sat heavy in her silence. Ethan nodded once. He'd learned not to argue with blame in the moment. He wrapped her hands, checked her feet, set her by the fire. He offered water warmed carefully, explained why slowly, without condescension. Megan listened. Competence recognized competence. The storm raged through the night, testing every seam. Snow piled against the walls. Wind shrieked through the chimney in bursts that rattled stone. Ethan stayed awake, feeding the fire, counting supplies with ruthless honesty. 2 days, maybe 3, if nothing went wrong. Enough if he didn't make mistakes. Koda shifted positions as the door shook, turning his body to block drafts, lifting his head whenever the pitch changed. At one point, the dog rose abruptly and moved to the far wall, nose pressed low. He let out a single sharp bark and pawed at a seam Ethan had missed. Cold air poured through. Ethan patched it just in time, canvas and board wedged tight. The fire steadied. Megan watched with wide, grateful eyes, understanding dawning that the dog was not just comfort. He was warning. Sleep came in turns. Megan dozed fitfully, jacket still on, responsibility slow to release its grip. Liam slept deeper now, cheek pressed into Koda's side, breath even. Ethan leaned back against the wall, radio beside him, rifle untouched across his knees out of habit rather than intent. The storm could scream. Tonight, it would not take these people. When his mind threatened to slip toward old noise, Ethan anchored himself in action, adjusting the fire, checking the seals, counting breaths. Koda's presence grounded the room, a constant that asked nothing and promised everything. Morning did not come clean. The storm lingered, patient and punishing. The shack was half buried now. Snow banked high against the walls. Ethan stepped outside briefly and felt the cold cut deeper than before, sharper, as if winter had decided to show its teeth. He returned quickly, conserving heat. The radio crackled once, then died. Megan's jaw set. "We'll wait," she said, not a question. Ethan nodded. "We'll hold." They settled into a rhythm born of necessity. Food divided precisely. Water warmed slowly. Megan helped where she could, checking Liam's extremities, massaging circulation, speaking to him in a low, steady voice that soothed even when words failed. She checked Koda's paws for ice, surprised at herself when she thanked the dog aloud. Koda accepted the attention with calm dignity, eyes flicking to Ethan as if for confirmation. Ethan gave a small nod. The dog stayed. On the second night, the wind rose again, louder, meaner. The shack groaned. Ethan felt the old edge sharpen in his chest. Before it could take him, Koda moved, placing his head against Ethan's thigh, then his chest, breath slow and deliberate. Ethan matched it. In. Out. The storm howled itself hoarse. Inside, 3 lives held together by heat, discipline, and a dog who refused to leave his post. When the storm finally eased, it did so grudgingly. Light filtered through the seams, pale and tentative. Ethan opened the door to a world scoured clean. Snow lay deep and brilliant. The forest bowed, humbled. He looked back at Megan and Liam, at Koda sitting tall and steady, and understood that the shack was no longer just his. It had become a line held against the worst winter could offer. He closed the door gently and went back to the fire, already planning what would need repair. Survival was no longer theoretical. It was shared. The rescue team reached the clearing in the pale afternoon, their snowshoes creaking softly against a world that still smelled of storm. They came in a staggered line through the trees, bright jackets cutting against the white, breath rising in steady clouds. At the front was Deputy Mark Halverson, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a square jaw, wind-burned cheeks, and a beard trimmed short enough to keep ice from clinging. Years of winter calls had given him a voice that stayed calm even when things went wrong, and eyes that learned to measure a scene before judging it. He stopped short when he saw the shack. Snow was banked nearly to the lower logs, the tarp scarred and patched, the chimney dark against the sky with a thin ribbon of smoke still rising. Mark let out a slow breath. "I didn't expect anything still standing up here," he said, not to anyone in particular. Ethan Parker stepped outside before they called out, Coda at his side. Ethan looked older in daylight, exhaustion etched into the angles of his face, beard thicker now, eyes shadowed but clear. He raised one hand in a small economical greeting. Coda stood squarely beside him, posture relaxed but alert, tail low, gaze steady. Megan Turner followed, one arm around Liam's shoulders. She looked changed, not healed exactly, but upright, composed, the way people look when they've crossed something and come back carrying proof. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back again, practical and neat, her skin still pale but no longer gray with cold. Liam leaned into her, cheeks flushed with warmth and life, eyes bright as they fixed on the rescuers and then drifted back to Coda. "You kept them alive," Mark said as he stepped closer, the words stripped of ceremony. He looked from Megan to the boy, then back to Ethan. "All of them." Ethan shook his head once, not denying, not accepting. "We held together," he said. It was the closest he came to explanation. The medics moved quickly, checking vitals, wrapping Liam in additional insulation, testing Megan's fingers and toes. Minor frostnip, dehydration, exhaustion, but alive. One of the younger rescuers, Chris Lowell, knelt by the wall, gloved hand running along the stonework. Chris was in his late 20s, lean and earnest, with a narrow face reddened by cold and eyes that still carried a kind of belief. "This held," he said quietly, disbelief threading his voice. "In that storm." Ethan said nothing. He hadn't built the shack for testimony. The sleds turned back toward Pine Hollow before dusk. Megan and Liam bundled safely aboard. Coda walked alongside until the trees thinned, then stopped, watching until they disappeared. The forest closed in again, but it felt different now. Less like a barrier, more like a boundary. News traveled faster than snowmelt. By the time the rescue team reached town, the story had grown legs. Smoke seen miles away, a nurse and a child found alive. A lone laborer and his dog holding a line against the worst storm in years. Pine Hollow received them with a different silence than before. Careful, almost reverent. People gathered near the firehouse, hats pulled low, breath held as Megan stepped down from the sled. Applause came hesitantly at first, then stronger, awkward and sincere. Ethan stood off to the side, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. He was not built for crowds. Sarah Whitlow watched from the diner doorway, her apron forgotten in her hands. In the winter light she looked softer than Ethan remembered, tall and slender, chestnut hair tucked beneath a knit cap, pale skin flushed pink from the cold. Her gray-blue eyes followed Ethan, curiosity giving way to something warmer. She remembered the laughter, the easy judgments, and felt a pinch of shame. When Ethan's gaze flicked briefly toward her, she offered a small nod. A quiet apology. Ethan returned it, equally small. That was enough. Inside the firehouse, coffee was poured and questions asked. Deputy Halverson clapped Ethan on the shoulder with the familiarity reserved for men who had shared something dangerous. "Town owes you," he said. "We could use someone like you on maintenance. Roads, winter prep, repairs." A local mill owner cleared his throat and offered steady pay for honest work, no shortcuts. Others followed. Materials, help, hands. Words piled up like gifts Ethan hadn't asked for. He listened politely, a faint smile touching his mouth but never reaching his eyes. "I appreciate it," he said finally. He glanced toward the windows beyond which the forest waited, unchanged. "But I'm where I need to be." The pause that followed wasn't disappointment. It was understanding. Ethan returned to the clearing before dark, Ranger, Coda, trotting easily beside him. Back at the shack, he set about repairs, reinforcing seams, stacking fresh wood, widening the hearth so the fire could breathe. Over the next weeks, the work changed in character, less frantic, more deliberate. He added a proper door, squared the lean-to, and extended it just enough to shelter a lost hiker out of the wind. He accepted help without ceremony. Townsfolk brought boards, nails, a better radio. Sarah hiked the last stretch one afternoon with a basket of bread and canned goods, her chestnut hair braided tight, breath fogging as she smiled shyly and said, "Figured you might need these." They spoke of small things. Weather, quiet, the way sound changes in snow. She didn't ask about the war. He didn't offer. Respect settled between them naturally. Megan came when roads allowed, bringing medical kits, extra batteries, weather updates. She moved through the clearing with purpose, tall and lean, muscles wired from long days on her feet, eyes always checking corners. Liam visited too, bundled into layers that made him rounder than he was, cheeks bright, voice loud with questions. To him, Coda was not just a dog, he was a hero. Liam followed him everywhere, mimicking his alert stance, laughing when Coda finally tolerated a clumsy hug. Coda accepted the attention with dignified patience, allowing the boy to lean against him and whisper secrets into his fur. Word spread beyond Pine Hollow. A pair of snowmobilers caught in a whiteout found the smoke and knocked on Ethan's door one evening, hands shaking, faces pale. An elderly man from a neighboring county limped in with frostbitten toes and an apology he insisted on delivering before accepting help. Ethan took them all in without questions that didn't need answers. He offered warmth, food, quiet. The shack became what it was meant to be, not a fortress against the world, but a shelter within it. Ethan carved a small sign from scrap wood and mounted it near the door. The letters were uneven, the work plain. Coda's light. Shelter for lost souls. Coda watched the process with solemn approval. As winter loosened its grip and the days lengthened, Ethan noticed a shift inside himself. Sleep came more often now, deeper, unbroken. When memories surfaced, they no longer arrived as ambushes. They came like visitors, unwelcome sometimes, but manageable. Healing, he learned, was not forgetting. It was learning where to place the weight. One evening, as the fire crackled and Coda rested his head on Ethan's knee, Ethan thought of the man he'd been when he arrived, silent, coiled, convinced solitude was the only way to survive. He understood now that solitude had been the beginning, not the end. Outside, snow fell softly, no longer threatening. The shack stood firm, smoke rising steadily into the dark. It was not impressive by any official measure. There were no plaques, no speeches. But it had saved lives. It had turned pain into shelter and fear into purpose. Ethan rested his hand on Coda's neck and felt the steady pulse there, a reminder of loyalty earned and returned. This was home, not because it erased what had been lost, but because it gave what remained somewhere to belong. When spring finally dared to arrive, the smoke still rose on cold mornings, no longer a sign of a man hiding, but of a door that would open. This story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright light. Often, God works quietly, through steady hands that refuse to give up, through loyalty that stays when everything else walks away, through a door that opens even when the storm says it shouldn't. Ethan didn't wait for life to be easy. He kept the fire alive, kept building, kept loving, and in doing so, his pain became shelter for others. In our daily lives, we all face winters, seasons of loneliness, exhaustion, loss, or fear, when the road disappears and hope feels far away. Faith does not mean the storms stop coming. Faith means choosing to stand anyway, choosing kindness when no one is watching, trusting that God can use even our broken places to protect someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Comment Amen if you believe that God still works miracles in quiet ways. And subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, loyalty, and unseen heroes. May God bless you and keep you. May He give you strength in your storms, peace in your nights, and purpose in your pain. And may your life, wherever you are, become a light for someone lost in the cold.